Welcome to Trinity Rep Radio Theater, a monthly program of dramatic literature featuring Trinity Repertory Company's resident acting company, produced by Trinity Rep and WRNI. Today's show is titled Eudora Welty's People, featuring two stories by the late great Southern writer. I'm your host, Bob C., and joining me is Kurt Columbus, Trinity Rep's artistic director, and four members of the resident acting company, Janice Duclos, Mauro Hantman, Ann Scaria, and Rachel Warren. Welcome, everyone.
Hello, Bob.
Kurt, tell us about the two stories we'll hear today.
Well, Bob, first I want to introduce everyone to Eudora Welty because there may be people in our audience who are unfamiliar with her, which would be a shame because she's one of the undisputed literary geniuses of the 20th century. I'm so thrilled. We've been trying to put this show together for a couple of years, and we're finally going to do two of her stories today. Welty wrote two novels, The Robber Bridegroom and The Optimist's Daughter, and one memoir called One Writer's Beginnings. But she's most loved, I think, for her short stories. She received every major literary award in her lifetime and was the first living author to be included in the Library of America series. And her stories deal with life in her hometown of Jackson, Mississippi. We've chosen two pieces published in the 1941 collection, A Curtain of Green. And these are two of her best-known stories. One is called Why I Live at the P.O., and the other is called Petrified Man. We're going to start with The Petrified Man. It takes place in that unique bastion of feminine power, the small-town beauty parlor.
Eudora Welty's Petrified Man, featuring Janice Duclos, Mauro Hantman, and Rachel Warren, here on Trinity Rep Radio Theater.
Leota's 10 o'clock shampoo and set customer was Mrs. Fletcher.
Mrs. Fletcher, honey, reach in my purse and get me a cigarette without no powder in it, if you can. I don't like no perfume cigarettes.
Mrs. Fletcher gladly reached over to the lavender shelf under the lavender-framed mirror and opened the patent leather purse.
Why, look at the peanuts, Leota.
Honey, them goobers has been in my purse a week if they's been in it a day. Mrs. Pike bought them peanuts.
Who's Mrs. Pike?
Mrs. Fletcher settled back, hidden in this den of curling fluid and henna packs, separated by a lavender swing door from the other customers who were being gratified in other booths. She could give her curiosity its freedom. She looked expectantly at the black part in Leota's yellow curls as she bent to light the cigarette. Leota puffed and pressed into Mrs. Fletcher's scalp with strong, red-nailed fingers.
Mrs. Pike is this lady from New Orleans. A friend, not a customer. You see, like maybe I told you last time, me and Fred and Sal and Joe all had us a fuss. So Sal and Joe up and moved out. So we didn't do a thing but rent out their room. So we rented it to Mrs. Pike and Mr. Pike.
She flicked an ash into the basket of dirty towels.
Mrs. Pike is a very decided blonde. She bought me the peanuts.
She must be cute.
Oh, honey, cute ain't a word for what she is. I'm telling you, Mrs. Pike is attractive. She has her a good time. She's got a sharp eye out, Mrs. Pike has.
She dashed the comb through the air and paused dramatically as a cloud of Mrs. Fletcher's hennaed hair floated out of the lavender teeth like a small storm cloud.
Hair falling.
Oh, Leota.
Commencing to fall out.
She combed again and let fall another cloud.
Is it any dandruff in it?
Mrs. Fletcher was frowning, her hairline eyebrows diving down toward her nose, and her wrinkled, beady-lashed eyelids batting with concentration.
Nope, just falling out.
Bet it was that last permit you gave me that did it. Remember, you cooked me 14 minutes.
Oh, you had 14 minutes coming to you.
Bound to be something. Dandruff. Couldn't have caught a thing like that from Mr. Fletcher, could I?
Well, you know what I heard in here yesterday? One of Thelma's ladies was sitting over yonder getting a machineless, and I don't mean to insist or insinuate or anything, Mrs. Fletcher, but she just happened to throw out that you was P-R-E-G. And lots of times that'll make your hair do awful funny. Fall out and God knows what all. It just ain't our fault, is the way I look at it.
The women stared at each other in the mirror.
Who was it?
Honey, I really couldn't say. Not that you look it.
Where's Thelma? I'll get it out of her.
No, honey, I wouldn't go and get mad over a little thing like that.
Leota was combing hastily as though to hold Mrs. Fletcher down by the hair.
I'm sure it was somebody didn't mean no harm in the world. How far gone are you?
Was it that Mrs. Hutchinson?
Mrs. Hutchinson? No, she come on Thursday and didn't even mention your name. I doubt if she even knows you're on the way.
All I know is whoever it is will be sorry someday. Why, I just barely knew it myself. Just let her wait.
Why? What are you gonna do to her?
The women looked down and saw a little boy making tents with aluminum wave pinchers on the floor under the sink.
Billy boy, hun, mustn't bother nice ladies.
Leota slapped him brightly.
Oh, ain't Billy boy a sight. Only 3 years old and already just nuts about the beauty parlor business.
I never saw him here before.
He ain't been here before, that's how come. He belongs to Mrs. Pike. She got her a job, but it was Fay's millinery, and of course he's gonna put 'em on. Hats. They told Mrs. Pike they didn't appreciate him hanging around there. Here, he couldn't hurt a thing.
Well, I don't like children that much.
Well,
I'm almost tempted not to have this one. That Mrs. Hutchinson just looks straight through you when she sees you on the street and then spits at you behind your back.
Mr. Fletcher'd beat you on the head if you didn't have it now, after going this far.
Mr. Fletcher can't do a thing with me.
He can't.
Leota winked at herself in the mirror.
No, sirree, he can't. If he so much as raises his voice against me, he knows good and well I'll have one of my sick headaches, and then I'm just not fit to live with. And if I really look that pregnant already...
Well, now, honey, I just want you to know I haven't told any of my ladies, and I ain't gonna tell 'em, even that you're losing your hair. You just get you one of those store-colored dresses and stop worrying. What people don't know don't hurt nobody, as Mrs. Pike says.
Did you tell Mrs. Pike?
Well, Mrs. Fletcher, look, you ain't never gonna lay eyes on Mrs. Pike, or her lay eyes on you, so what difference does it make in the long run?
I knew it! Mrs. Pike!
Mrs. Fletcher deliberately nodded her head so as to destroy a ringlet Leota was working on behind her ear.
I reckon I might as well tell you. It wasn't any more Thelma's lady told me you was pregnant than a bat.
Not Mrs. Hutchinson?
Oh, Lord, it was Mrs. Pike.
Mrs. Pike?
Mrs. Fletcher could only sputter and let curling fluid roll into her ear.
How could Mrs. Pike possibly know I was pregnant or otherwise when she doesn't even know me? The nerve of some people.
Well, here's how it was. Remember Sunday?
Yes.
Sunday, Mrs. Pike and me was all by ourselves. Mr. Pike and Fred had gone over to Eagle Lake, saying they was going to catch 'em some fish, but they didn't, of course. So we was sitting in Mrs. Pike's car. It's a 1939 Dodge.
1939,
And we was getting us a Jack's Bear piece. That's the beer Mrs. Pike says is made right in New Orleans, so she won't drink no other kind. So I seen you drive up to the drugstore and run in just for a second, leaving, I reckon, Mr. Fletcher in the car, and come running out with looked like a prescription. So I says to Mrs. Pike, just to be making talk, right yonder's Mrs. Fletcher, and I reckon that's Mr. Fletcher. She's one of my regular customers, I says.
I had on a figured print.
You sure did. So Mrs. Pike, she gave you a good look. She's very observant, a good judge of character, cute as a minute, you know. And she says, I bet you another Jack's that lady's 3 months on the way.
What? Gall. Mrs. Pike.
Oh, Mrs. Pike ain't gonna bite you. Mrs. Pike is a lovely girl. You be crazy about her, Mrs. Fletcher. But she can't sit still a minute. We went to the Traveling Freak Show yesterday after work in the vacant store next door. What, you ain't been?
No, I despise freaks.
Oh, well, honey, talking about being pregnant and all, you ought to see those twins in a bottle. You really owe it to yourself.
What twins?
Oh, well, honey, they got these 2 twins in a bottle, see? Born, joined, plumb together. Dead, of course. They was about this long, and they had these 2 heads and 2 faces and 4 arms and 4 legs all kind of joined here. See, this face looked this way, the other face looked that way over their shoulder, see? Kind of pathetic.
Gluck.
Well, ugly. Oh, honey, I mean to tell you, their parents was first cousins and all like that. Billy boy, get me a fresh towel from off Teeny's stack. This is wringing wet, and quit tickling my ankles with that curler. I declare he don't miss nothing.
Me and Mr. Fletcher aren't one speck of kin, or he could never have had me.
Course not. Neither's me and Fred. Not that we know of.
She made a deep wave over Mrs. Fletcher's other temple with the comb.
Ooh, and they got this man, this petrified man that everything since he was 9 years old when it goes through his digestion, see? Somehow, Mrs. Pike says, it goes to his joints and has been turning to stone.
How awful.
Oh, he could move his head a quarter inch like this. Of course, his head and mind ain't a joint, so to speak. And I guess his stomach ain't either. Not yet, anyways. He's turning to stone. How'd you like to be married to a guy like that? Of course, he looks just terrible.
I should think he would. Mr. Fletcher takes bending exercises every night of the world. I make him.
All Fred does is lay around the house like a rug. I wouldn't be surprised if he woke up someday and couldn't move. With the petrified man just sat there moving his quarter of an inch, though. Billy boy, go see if Thelma's got any dry cotton. Look how Mrs. Fletcher's a-dripping.
Where did Mrs. Pike meet Mr. Pike?
On a train.
I met Mr. Fletcher, or rather, he met me, in a rental library.
Honey, me and Fred, we met in a rumble seat 8 months ago, and we was practically on what you might call the way to the altar inside a half an hour. Of course, it don't last. Mrs. Pike says nothing like that ever lasts.
Mr. Fletcher and myself are as much in love as the day we married.
Leota stuffed cotton into Mrs. Fletcher's ears.
Mrs. Pike says it don't last. Now, go get under the dryer. You can turn yourself on, can't you? I'll be back to comb you out. During lunch, I promised to give Mrs. Pike a facial.
I bet she needs one.
Mrs. Fletcher let the swing door fly back against Leota.
Oh, pardon me.
A week later, on time for her appointment, Mrs. Fletcher sank heavily into Leota's chair. She stared in a discouraged way into the mirror.
You can tell it when I'm sitting down, all right.
Leota seemed preoccupied and stood shaking out a lavender cloth. She began to pin it around Mrs. Fletcher's neck in silence.
I said you sure can tell it when I'm sitting straight on and coming at you this way.
What? No, honey, no you can't. Why, I'd never know. If somebody was to come up to me on the street and say Mrs. Fletcher's pregnant, I'd say, heck, she don't look it to me.
If a certain party hadn't found it out and spread it around, wouldn't be too late even now.
But Leota was almost choking her with the cloth, pinning it so tight, and she couldn't speak clearly. She paddled her hands in the air until Leota wearily loosened her.
Listen, honey, you're just a virgin compared to Mrs. Montjoy.
She bent Mrs. Fletcher back in the chair, tossed liquid from a teacup onto her head, and dug both hands into her scalp.
You know Mrs. Montjoy? Her husband's that premature gray-headed fella.
She's in the Trojan Garden Club's all I know.
Well, honey, she came in here not the week before, and not the day before she had a baby. She come in here the very self-same day. Child, we was all plumb scared to death. There she was, come for her shampoo and set. Why, Mrs. Fletcher, in an hour and 20 minutes, she was laying up there in the Baptist hospital with a 7-pound son. It was that close a shave. I declare, if I hadn't been so tired, I would have drank up a bottle of gin that night.
What gall. I never knew her at all well.
See, her husband was waiting outside in the car, and her bags was all packed in the back seat, and she was all ready, except she wanted her shampoo and set. And having one pain right after another, her husband kept coming in here, scared-like, but he couldn't do nothing with her. She yelled bloody murder, too. But she always yelled her head off when I gave her a permanent.
She must have been crazy. How did she look? Well, I can guess. Awful.
Just wanted to look pretty while she was having her baby, is all. Of course, we was glad to give the lady what she was after. That's our motto. But I bet an hour later she wasn't paying no mind to them little end curls.
Her husband ought to could make her behave. Don't it seem that way to you? He ought to put his foot down.
A lot of good he could do. Maybe some women is soft.
You mistake me. I don't mean for her to get soft. Far from it. Women have to stand up for themselves. There's just no telling. But now you take me. I ask Mr. Fletcher's advice now and then, and he appreciates it, especially on something important, like, is it time for a permanent? Not that I've told him about the baby. He says, why, dear, go ahead. Just ask the advice.
Oh, if I had asked Fred's advice, we'd be floating down the Yazoo River on a houseboat or something by this time. I'm sick of Fred. Lays around the house and bulls. Did bull with that good-for-nothing Mr. Pike. He says if he goes, who'll cook? But I says I never get to eat anyway, not meals. Billy boy, take Mrs. Grover that screen secrets and leg it.
Mrs. Fletcher heard stamping feet go out the door. She sat up gingerly.
Is that Mrs. Pike's little boy here again?
Yeah, that's still him.
Leota stuck out her tongue. Mrs. Fletcher could hardly believe her eyes.
Well, how's Mrs. Pike? Your attractive new friend with the sharp eyes who spreads it around town the perfect strangers are pregnant.
Mrs. Pike.
Leota combed Mrs. Fletcher's hair with heavy strokes.
You act like you're tired.
Tired? Feel like it's 4 o'clock in the afternoon already. I ain't told you the awful luck we had, me and Fred. It's the worst thing you ever heard of. Maybe you think Mrs. Pike's got sharp eyes. Shoot, there's a limit. Well, you know, we rented out our room to this Mr. and Mrs. Pike from New Orleans when Sal and Joe Fentress got mad at us 'cause they drank up some homebrew we had in the closet, Sal and Joe did. So, a week ago Saturday, Mr. and Mrs. Pike moved in. Well, I kind of fixed up the room, you know. Put a soft pillow on the couch and picked some ragged robins and put 'em in a vase, but they never did say they appreciated it. Anyway, then I put some old magazines on the table.
I think that was lovely.
Oh, wait. So, come night before last, Fred and this Mr. Pike, who Fred just took up with, was back from, they said, was fishing, being as neither one of 'em's got a job to his name, and we was all sitting round their room. So Mrs. Pike was sitting there, reading an old Scotland G-Man tales that was mine, mind you, I bought it myself, and then all of a sudden she jumps into the air. You'd think she'd set on a spider and says, "Canfield!" Ain't that silly? That's Mr. Pike. "Canfield! My God Almighty!" she says. "Honey," she says, "we're rich, and you won't have to work." Not that he turned one hand anyway. Well, me and Fred rushes over to her, and Mr. Pike, too, and there she sits, pointing her finger at a photo in my copy of Scotland G-Man. "See that man?" yells Mrs. Pike. "Remember him, Canfield?" Mr. Pike says, "Never forget a face. It's Mr. Petrie, that we stayed with him in the apartment next to ours in Toulouse Street in New Orleans for 6 weeks. Mr. Petrie." "Well," says Mrs. Pike, like she can't hold out a second longer, "Mr. Petrie is wanted for $500 cash for raping 4 women in California, and I know where he is."
Mercy! Where was he?
Leota had washed her hair, and now she yanked her up by the back locks and sat her up.
Know where he was?
I certainly don't.
Her scalp hurt all over. Leota flung a towel around the top of her head.
Nowhere else but in that freak show. I saw him just as plain as Mrs. Pike. He was the petrified man.
Who would ever have thought that?
So Mr. Pike says, "Well, what do you know about that?" And he looks real hard at the photo and whistles, and she starts dancing and singing about their good luck. She meant our bad luck. That magazine was laying around the house for a month, and there was $500 in it for somebody. And there was the freak show running night and day, not 2 steps away from my own beauty parlor, with Mr. Petrie just sitting there waiting. And it had to be Mrs. Pike. Almost perfect strangers.
What gall!
Mrs. Fletcher was only sitting there wrapped in a turban, but she did not mind.
Oh, and Mrs. Pike, she goes round acting like she thinks she was Mrs. God. So, they're going to leave tomorrow, Mr. and Mrs. Pike. And in the meantime, I gotta keep that mean, bad little old kid here getting under my feet every minute of the day and talking back to...
Have they gotten the $500 reward already?
Well, at first, Mr. Pike didn't want to do anything about it. Can you feature that? Said he kind of liked the old bird and said he was real nice to him, lent him money or something. But Mrs. Pike says, "You ain't worked a lick in 6 months, and here I make $500 in 2 seconds, and what thanks do I get for it?" So they called the cops, and they caught the old bird, all right there at the freak show, where I saw him with my own eyes, thinking he was petrified. He's the one. Did it under his real name, Mr. Petrie. 4 women in California, all in the month of August. So, Mrs. Pike gets $500. And my magazine right next door to my beauty parlor. I cried all night. But Fred said it wasn't a bit of use and to go to sleep because the whole thing was just a sort of coincidence. You know, can't do nothing about it. We have to rent out the room again. No telling who we'll get this time.
But can you imagine anybody knowing this old man that's raped 4 women? Whoa! Did Mrs. Pike speak to him when she met him in the freak show?
Leota had begun to comb Mrs. Fletcher's hair.
I says to her, I didn't notice you falling on his neck when he was the petrified man. Don't tell me you didn't recognize your fine friend. And she says, I didn't recognize him with that white powder all over his face. He just looked familiar, Mrs. Pike says. And lots of people looked familiar. But when she seen the photo, it all come to her like a flash. Mr. Petrie. The way he turned his head and look at her when she took him in his breakfast.
Took him in his breakfast? Listen, don't tell me. I'd have felt something.
4 women! I guess those women didn't have the faintest notion at the time they'd be worth $125 apiece someday to Mrs. Pike. We asked her how the old fellow was then, and she said he must have had 1 foot in the grave at least. Can you beat it?
Not really petrified at all, of course. I'd have felt something.
Shoot, I did feel something. I told Fred when I got home I felt so funny. I said, Fred, that old petrified man sure did leave me with a funny feeling. He says, funny ha-ha, or funny peculiar. And I says, funny peculiar.
She pointed her comb into the air emphatically.
I'll bet you did.
They both heard a crackling noise.
Billy boy, what you doing in my purse?
I'm just eating these old stale peanuts up.
You come here to me! This is the last straw!
Leota recklessly flung down the comb, which scattered a whole ashtray full of bobby pins and knocked down a row of Coca-Cola bottles.
Oh, I caught him. I hold him on my lap. You bad, bad boy, you. I guess I'd better learn how to spank little old bad boys.
Leota paddled him heartily with the brush, while he gave angry but belittling screams which penetrated beyond the booth and filled the whole curious beauty parlor. From everywhere, ladies began to gather round to watch the paddling. Billy Boy kicked both Leota and Mrs. Fletcher as hard as he could, Mrs. Fletcher with her new fixed smile.
There, my little man. You won't be able to sit down for a week.
Billy Boy stomped through the wild-haired ladies to the door.
If you're so smart, why ain't you rich?
Eudora Welty's Petrified Man, featuring Janice Duclos, Morrow Hantman, and Rachel Warren here on Trinity Rep Radio Theater. Well, thanks to Eudora Welty's writing and your great performances, you took us right to that beauty parlor down south, and it's just amazing, the detail and the way she just takes you there. It's so authentic.
You are absolutely right. One of the remarkable things about her work is the place. I mean, the way in which she locates us as her auditors in this case. And it's just incredible how detailed a world that we, from the little bits that we pick up, right? You know, about,
I love all the references to the lavender. The whole place is shades of lavender.
Oh, you can just picture it, right? And we were talking, Bob, in rehearsal the other day about Leota's part. One of the first things that Morrow says in the narration is the black part in the middle of the blonde curls. And it's just, it's really kind of extraordinary. I'm struck every time we do this by the way in which the tiniest change in inflection on the part of the actor, you know, changes how we think about Mr. and Mrs. Pike. And Rachel does this amazing thing with the way she says Pike. Sometimes it's Pike up on a pedestal, goddess-like, and sometimes it's Pike down in the muck. You know, it's really incredible. I mean, it can you talk about how you're using the language to sort of evoke the emotional state?
Oh, I don't know. I think you know, there are some accents that really use inflection and pitch variation in such an expressive way, and the Southern dialect is just one of those things. I mean, it's sort of like standard British in the way that they just will go all over the map, and they can just have, you know, they can elongate things or make them really kind of crunchy, and it's just so much fun to play with, and I don't know. And this idea of Mrs. Pike is sort of, you know, I can just picture it from growing up in a small town, you know, this person who comes in from someplace glamorous like New Orleans, you know what I mean? And it's people either are very suspicious of her, but also in awe of this other, and how you can be taken in by that, but it can change on a dime,
right,
too, if she turns her allegiance against you. So it's just fun to...
Yeah.
And how Mrs. Fletcher perceives leaves this as sort of coming in between her and Leota, this Mrs. Pike, this outsider coming in. I mean, there's something iconic, isn't there, about the relationship between a hairdresser and her client?
Yes.
Somehow there's like an instant intimacy there, or a candor when you speak, and I love the way she sets it up, even physically. The fact that there are these little booths where they go in,
It's
and
like
Mrs.
the confessional,
Fletcher,
or it's like some private. Yeah.
She says everybody's
Place
getting pleasured.
Yeah. More like a peep show.
But you really get the impression that the women are running things. The men are, kind of afterthoughts, right? They're just they don't work. They don't work. They don't do anything. What do they do?
They don't even have a voice in the story except for the little tiny boy that they beat at the end of the story. I mean, it's really incredible.
They get to give their advice about when to have a permanent. I mean, not so much about having a baby. But
Yeah, that's one of our favorite lines, Bob, is when Mrs. Fletcher says, it's good to ask a husband's advice about important things like, is it time to get a permanent? And then she says, but, I still haven't told him about the baby.
Right.
And
is the husband not going to respond, yes? It's time to have a permanent?
Right.
I also love the way she has, so many things going on simultaneously, just like it would happen in a beauty parlor. Things going on. She's talking about one thing, and then all of a sudden there's other things going on. There's the little boy. There's these other things, that it just keeps moving so quickly.
Right. Yeah. It's the beauty of the writing that brings out such vibrant place and character, and we're going to see that in the next story. Maybe we should just leap forward onto that one. One of Emily Atkinson, one of our producers, brought this story to me and Janice about a year ago, and we have wanted to do this story for so long. It's called Why I Live at the P.O. It's from the same 1941 collection of stories, and it's about a Mississippi family choosing sides in their very, very own private civil war.
Let's listen to Eudora Welty's story, Why I Live at the P.O., featuring Janice Duclos, Mauro Hantman, Ann Scaria, and Rachel Warren here on Trinity Rep Radio Theater.
I was getting along fine with Mama, Papa Daddy, and Uncle Rondo until my sister, Stella Rondo, just separated from her husband and came back home again. Mr. Whitaker. Of course, I went with Mr. Whitaker first, when he first appeared here in China Grove, taking pose-yourself photos, and Stella Rondo broke us up, told him I was one-sided, bigger on one side than the other, which is a deliberate, calculated falsehood. I'm the same. Stella Rondo is exactly 12 months to the day younger than I am, and for that reason she's spoiled. She's always had anything in the world she wanted, and then she'd throw it away. As soon as she got married and moved away from home, the first thing she did was separate from Mr. Whitaker. This photographer with a Popeyes she said she trusted. Came home from one of those towns up in Illinois and, to our complete surprise, brought this child of 2. Mama said she liked to make her drop dead for a second.
Here, you had this marvelous blonde child and never so much as wrote your mother a word about it. I'm thoroughly ashamed of you.
But of course she wasn't. Stella Rondo just calmly takes off this hat. I wish you could see it.
Why, Mama, Shirley T's adopted. I can prove it.
How?
All I says was, huh. There I was over the hot stove trying to stretch 2 chickens over 5 people and a completely unexpected child into the bargain without one moment's notice.
What do you mean? Huh.
I heard that, sister.
I said that, I didn't mean a thing, only that whoever Shirley T was, she was the spit image of Papa Daddy if he'd cut off his beard, which of course he'd never do in the world. Papa Daddy's mama's papa, and sulks. Stella Rondo got furious.
Sister, I don't need to tell you got a lot of nerve and always did have, and I'll thank you to make no future reference to my adopted child whatsoever.
Very well, very well. Of course, I noticed at once she looks like Mr. Whitaker's side, too. That frown. She looks like a cross between Mr. Whitaker and Papa Daddy.
Well, all I can say is she isn't.
Oh, she looks exactly like Shirley Temple to me.
But Shirley T just ran away from her. So the first thing Stella Rondo did at the table was turn Papa Daddy against me. I was completely taken by surprise. Papa Daddy is about 1,000,000 years old and's got this long, long beard. He was trying to cut up his meat.
Papa Daddy? Papa Daddy? Sister says she fails to understand why you don't cut off your beard.
So Papa Daddy lays down his knife and fork. He's real rich. Mama says he is. He says he isn't.
Have I heard correctly? You don't understand why I don't cut off my beard?
Why, Papa Daddy, of course I understand. I did not say any such of a thing. The idea.
Hussy!
I says, Papa Daddy, you know I wouldn't any more want you to cut off your beard than the man in the moon. It was the farthest thing from my mind. Stella Rondo sat there and made that up while she was eating breasted chicken.
So the postmistress fails to understand why I don't cut off my beard. Which job I got you through my influence with the government. Bird's nest? Is that what you call it?
Not that it isn't the next to smallest P.O. in the entire state of Mississippi. Oh, Papa Daddy, I didn't say any such of a thing. I never dreamed it was a bird's nest. I have always been grateful, though this is the next to smallest P.O. in the state of Mississippi. And I do not enjoy being referred to as a hussy by my own grandfather.
Yes, you did say it too. Anybody in the world could have heard you that had ears.
Stop right there!
Mama is looking at me. So I pulled my napkin straight back through the napkin ring and left the table. As soon as I was out of the room, Mama says,
Call her back, or she'll starve to death.
This is the beard I started growing on the coast when I was 15 years old.
He would have gone on till nightfall if Shirley T. hadn't lost the Milky Way she ate in Cairo.
Oh.
I am going out and lie in the hammock, and you can all sit here and remember my words. I'll never cut off my beard as long as I live, even 1 inch, and I don't appreciate it in you at all.
Passed right by me in the hall and went straight out and got in the hammock. It would be a holiday. It wasn't 5 minutes before Uncle Rondo suddenly appeared in the hall in one of Stella Rondo's flesh-colored kimonos, all cut on the bias, like something Mr. Whitaker probably thought was gorgeous. Uncle Rondo, I didn't know who that was. Where are you going?
Sister, get out of my way. I'm poisoned.
If you're poisoned, stay away from Papa Daddy. Keep out of the hammock. Papa Daddy will certainly beat you on the head if you come within 40 miles of him. He thinks I deliberately said he ought to cut off his beard after he got me the P.O., and I've told him and told him and told him, and he acts like he just don't hear me. Papa Daddy must have gone stone deaf.
He picked a fine day to do it then.
And before you could say Jack Robinson, he flew out in the yard. What he'd really done, he'd drunk another bottle of that prescription. He does it every single 4th of July, as sure as shooting, and it's horribly expensive. Then he falls over in the hammock and snores. So he insisted on zigzagging right on out to the hammock, looking like a half-wit. Papa Daddy woke up with this horrible yell.
Ah!
And right there, without moving an inch, he tried to turn Uncle Rondo against me. I heard every word he said. Oh, he told Uncle Rondo I didn't learn to read till I was 8 years old, and he didn't see how in the world I ever got the mail put up at the P.O., much less read it all. And he said if Uncle Rondo could only fathom the lengths he had gone to get me that job. And he said, on the other hand, he thought Stella Rondo had a brilliant mind and deserved credit for getting out of town. All the time he was just lying there swinging as pretty as you please and looping out his beard, and poor Uncle Rondo was pleading with him to slow down the hammock. It was making him as dizzy as a witch to watch it. But that's what Papa Daddy likes about a hammock. So Uncle Rondo was too dizzy to get turned against me for the time being. He's Mama's only brother and is a good case of a one-track mind. Ask anybody, a certified pharmacist. Just then, I heard Stella Rondo raising the upstairs window. While she was married, she got this peculiar idea that it's cooler with the windows shut and locked, so she has to raise the window before she can make a soul hear her outdoors. So she raises the window and says, "Oh!" You would have thought she was mortally wounded. Uncle Rondo and Papa Daddy didn't even look up, but kept right on with what they were doing. I had to laugh. I flew up the stairs and threw open the door. What in the wide world's the matter, Stella Rondo? You mortally wounded?
No, I'm not mortally wounded, but I wish you would do me the favor of looking out that window there and telling me what you see.
So I shade my eyes and look out the window. I see the front yard.
Don't you see any human beings?
I see Uncle Rondo trying to run Papa Daddy out of the hammock, nothing more. Naturally, it's so suffocating hot in the house with all the windows shut and locked. Everybody who cares to stay in their right mind will have to go out and get in the hammock before the 4th of July is over.
Don't you notice anything different about Uncle Rondo?
Why, no, except he's got on some terrible-looking flesh-colored contraption I wouldn't be found dead in, is all I can see.
Never mind, you won't be found dead in it because it happens to be part of my trousseau, and Mr. Whitaker took several dozen photographs of me in it. What on earth could Uncle Rondo mean by wearing part of my trousseau out in the broad open daylight without saying so much as kiss my foot?
I'm sure I don't know. And what do you expect me to do about it? Jump out the window?
No, I expect nothing of the kind. I simply declare that Uncle Rondo looks like a fool in it, that's all. Oh, it makes me sick to my stomach.
Well, he looks as good as he can. As good as anybody in reason could. I stood up for Uncle Rondo, please remember. And I said to Stella Rondo, I think I would do well not to criticize so freely if I were you and came home with a 2-year-old child I had never said a word about and no explanation whatever about my separation.
I asked you the instant I entered this house not to refer one more time to my adopted child, and you gave me your word of honor. You would not.
This was all Stella Rondo would say, and started pulling out every one of her eyebrows with some cheap crest tweezers. So I merely slammed the door behind me and went down and made some green tomato pickle. Somebody had to do it. Mama trots in, lifts up the lid, and says,
"Oh, not very good for your Uncle Rondo in his precarious condition, I must say. Oh, poor little adopted Shirley T. Shame on you."
That made me tired. Well, Stella Rondo had better thank her lucky stars it was her instead of me came trotting in with that very peculiar-looking child. Now, if it had been me that trotted in from Illinois and brought a peculiar-looking child or two, I shudder to think of the reception I'd have got. Mama shakes a spoon in my face.
But you must remember, sister, that you were never married to Mr. Whitaker in the first place and didn't go up to Illinois to live. If you had, I would have been just as overjoyed to see you and your little adopted girl as I was to see Stella Rondo when you wound up with your separation and came on back home.
You would not.
Don't contradict me, I would.
But I said she couldn't convince me, though she talked till she was blue in the face. Besides, you know as well as I do that that child is not adopted.
She most certainly is adopted.
Why, Mama, Stella Rondo had her just as sure as anything in this world, and just too stuck up to admit it.
Why, sister, here I thought we were going to have a pleasant 4th of July, and you start right out not believing a word your own baby sister tells you.
Just like Cousin Annie Flo went to her grave denying the facts of life.
I told you if you ever mentioned Annie Flo's name, I'd slap your face.
And she slaps my face. All right, you wait and see.
I prefer to take my children's word for anything when it's humanly possible.
You ought to see Mama. She weighs 200 pounds and has real tiny feet. Just then, something perfectly horrible occurred to me. Mama, can that child talk? I simply had to whisper, Mama, I wonder if that child can be, in any way. Do you realize that she hasn't spoken one single solitary word to a human being up to this minute? This is the way she looks, and I look like this. Well, Mom and I just stood there and stared at each other. It was horrible.
I remember well that Joe Whitaker frequently drank like a fish. I believe to my soul he drank chemicals.
And without another word, she marches to the foot of the stairs and calls Stella Rondo.
Stella Rondo! Ooh, Stella Rondo!
What? Not even the grace to get up off the bed.
Can that child of yours talk?
Can she what?
Talk! Talk! Buddy!
Who says she can't talk?
Sister says so.
You didn't have to tell me. I know whose word of honor don't mean a thing in this house.
And in a minute, the loudest Yankee voice I ever heard in my life yells out,
I am Popeye the Sailor Man!
And then somebody jumps up and down in the upstairs hall. In another second, the house would have fallen down.
Not only talks, she can tap dance, which is more than some people I won't name can do.
Oh, why, the precious, darling thing, just as smart as she can be.
Starts talking baby talk right there. Then she turns on me.
Sister, you ought to be thoroughly ashamed. Run upstairs this instant and apologize to Stella Rondo and Shirley T.
Apologize for what? I merely wondered if the child was normal, that's all. Now that she's proved she is, why, I have nothing further to say. But Mama just turned on her heel and flew out, furious. She ran right upstairs and hugged the baby. She believed it was adopted. Stella Rondo hadn't done a thing but turn her against me from upstairs while I stood there helpless over the hot stove. So that made Mama, Papa Daddy, and the baby all on Stella Rondo's side. Next, Uncle Rondo. I must say that Uncle Rondo has been marvelous to me at various times in the past, and I was completely unprepared to be made to jump out of my skin the way it turned out. Once, Stella Rondo did something perfectly horrible to him, broke a chain letter from Flanders Field, and he took the radio back he had given her and gave it to me. Stella Rondo was furious. For 6 months we all had to call her Stella instead of Stella Rondo, or she wouldn't answer. I always thought Uncle Rondo had all the brains of the entire family. Another time, he sent me to Mammoth Cave with all expenses paid. But this would be the day he was drinking that prescription, the 4th of July. So at supper, Stella Rondo speaks up and says she thinks Uncle Rondo ought to try to eat a little something. So finally, Uncle Rondo said he would try a little cold biscuits and ketchup. But that was all. So she brought it to him. And I said, "Do you think it wise to disport with ketchup in Stella Rondo's flesh-colored kimono?" Trying to be considerate. If Stella Rondo couldn't watch out for her trousseau, somebody had to. So Uncle Rondo is just about to pour out all the ketchup.
Any objections?
Don't mind what she says, Uncle Rondo. Sister has been devoting this solid afternoon to sneering out my bedroom window at the way you look.
What's that?
Uncle Rondo has got the most terrible temper in the world. Anything is liable to make him tear the house down if it comes at the wrong time.
Sister says Uncle Rondo certainly does look like a fool in that pink kimono.
Do you remember who it really was said that? Uncle Rondo spills out all the ketchup and jumps out of his chair and tears off the kimono and throws it down on the dirty floor and puts his foot on it. It had to be sent all the way to Jackson to the cleaners and repleated.
So that's your opinion of your Uncle Rondo, is it? I look like a fool, do I? Well, that's the last straw. A whole day in this house with nothing to do, and then to hear you come out with a remark like that behind my back.
I didn't say any such of a thing, Uncle Rondo, and I'm not saying who did either. Why, I think you look all right. Just try to take care of yourself and not talk and eat at the same time. I think you better go lie down.
Lie down my foot.
I ought to have known by that he was fixing to do something perfectly horrible. So he didn't do anything that night in the precarious state he was in. Just played casino with Mama and Stella Rondo and Shirley T, and gave Shirley T a nickel with head on both sides. But at 6:30 a.m. the next morning, he threw a whole 5-cent package of some 1-inch firecrackers as hard as he could into my bedroom, and they every one went off. Not a bad one in the string. Anybody else, there would have been one that didn't go off. Well, I'm just terribly susceptible to noise of any kind. The doctor has always told me I was the most sensitive person he had ever seen in his whole life, and I was simply prostrated. I couldn't eat. People told me they heard it as far as the cemetery. And I'll tell you, it didn't take me any longer than a minute to make up my mind what to do. There I was, with a whole entire house on Stella Rondo's side and turned against me. If I have anything at all, I have pride. So I just decided I'd go straight down to the P.O. There's plenty of room there in the back, I says to myself. Well, I made no bones about letting the family catch on to what I was up to. I didn't try to conceal it. The first thing they knew, I marched in where they were all playing old maid and pulled the electric oscillating fan out by the plug, and everything got real hot. Next, I snatched the pillow I'd done the needlepoint on right off the davenport from behind Papa Daddy.
Ah!
I beat Stella Rondo up the stairs and finally found my charm bracelet in her bureau drawer under a picture of Nelson Eddy.
So that's the way the land lies. Well, sister, I'll be glad to donate my army cart if you got any place to set it up, providing you'll leave right this minute and let me get some peace.
Uncle Rondo was in France. Thank you kindly for the cart, and peace is hardly the word I would select if I had to resort to firecrackers at 6:30 a.m. in a young girl's bedroom. And as to where I intend to go, you seem to forget my position as postmistress of China Grove, Mississippi. I've always got the P.O. Well, that made them all sit up and take notice. I went out front and started digging up some 4 o'clocks to plant around the P.O. Mama raised the window.
Those happen to be my 4 o'clocks. Everything planted in that star is mine. I never known you to make anything grow in your life.
Very well, but I take the fern. Even you, Mama, can't stand there and deny that I'm the one watered that fern. And I happen to know where I can send in a box top and get a packet of 1,000 mixed seeds, no two the same kind, free.
Oh, where?
Too late. You tend to your house, and I'll tend to mine. You hear things like that all the time if you know how to listen to the radio. Perfectly marvelous offers. Get anything you want, free. I marched in and got that radio, and they could have all bit a nail in two, especially Stella Rondo that it used to belong to, and she well knew she couldn't get it back. I'd sue for it like a shot. And I very politely took the sewing machine motor I helped pay the most on to give Mama for Christmas back in 1929, and a good big calendar with the first aid remedies on it. The thermometer and the Hawaiian ukulele certainly were rightfully mine, and I stood on the stepladder and got all my watermelon rind preserves and every fruit and vegetable I'd put up, every single jar. Then I began to pull the tacks out of the bluebird wall vases on the archway to the dining room.
Who told you you could have those, Miss Priss?
I bought 'em, and I'll keep track of 'em. I'll tack 'em up, one on each side of the post office window, and you can see 'em when you come to ask me for your mail, if you're so dead to see 'em.
Not I! I'll never darken the door to that post office again if I live to be 100. Ungrateful child. After all the money we spent on you at the normal.
Me either. You can just let my mail lie there and rot for all I care. I'll never come and relieve you of a single solitary piece.
I should worry. And who you think's gonna sit down and write you all those big fat letters and postcards, by the way? Mr. Whitaker? Just because he was the only man ever dropped down in China Grove and you got him unfairly, is he going to sit down and write you a lengthy correspondence after you come home, giving no rhyme or reason whatsoever for your separation and no explanation for the presence of that child? I may not have your brilliant mind, but I fail to see it.
Sister, I told you 1,000 times that Stella Rhonda simply got homesick, and this child is far too big to be hers. Now, why don't you all just sit down and play casino?
Then Shirley T. sticks out her tongue at me in this perfectly horrible way. She has no more manners than the man in the moon. I told her she was going to cross her eyes like that someday and they'd stick. It's too late to stop me now. You should have tried that yesterday. I'm going to the P.O., and the only way you can possibly see me is to visit me there.
You'll never catch me setting foot in that post office, even if I should take a notion into my head to write a letter someplace. I won't have you reaching out of that little old window with a pair of shears and cutting off any beard of mine. I'm too smart for you.
We all are.
If you're so smart, where's Mr. Whitaker?
I'll thank you from now on to stop reading all the orders I get on postcards and telling everybody in China Grove what you think is the matter with them.
I draw my own conclusions and will continue in the future to draw them. If people want to write their inmost secrets on penny postcards, there's nothing in the wide world you can do about it, Uncle Rondo.
And if you think we'll ever write another postcard, you're sadly mistaken.
Cutting off your nose to spite your face, then. But if you're all determined to have no more to do with the U.S. mail, think of this. What will Stella Rondo do now if she wants to tell Mr. Whitaker to come after her? I knew she'd cry. She had a conniption fit right there in the kitchen. It will be interesting to see how long she holds out. And now I'm leaving.
Goodbye.
Oh, I declare To think that a family of mine should quarrel on the 4th of July or the day after over Stella Rondo leaving old Mr. Whitaker and having the sweetest little adopted child. It looks like we'd all be glad.
He left her, you mark my words. That's Mr. Whitaker. I know Mr. Whitaker. After all, I knew him first. I said from the beginning he'd up and leave her. I foretold every single thing that's happened.
Where did he go?
Probably to the North Pole if he knows what's good for him. But Stella Rondo just bawled and wouldn't say another word. She flew to her room and slammed the door.
Now, look what you've gone and done, sister. You go apologize.
I haven't got time. I'm leaving.
Well, what are you waiting around for?
So I just picked up the kitchen clock and marched off without saying kiss my foot or anything, and never did tell Stella Rondo goodbye. There was a girl going along on a little wagon right in front. Girl, come help me haul these things down the hill. I'm going to live in the post office. Took her 9 trips in her express wagon. Uncle Rondo came out on the porch and threw her a nickel. And that's the last I've laid eyes on any of my family or my family laid eyes on me for 5 solid days and nights. Stella Rondo may be telling the most horrible tales in the world about Mr. Whitaker, but I haven't heard them. As I tell everybody, I draw my own conclusions. But I like it here. It's ideal, as I've been saying. Hear the radio? All the war news. Radio, sewing machine, bookends, ironing board, and that great big piano lamp. Peace. That's what I like. Of course, there's not much mail. My family are naturally the main people in China Grove, and if they prefer to vanish from the face of the earth for all the mail they get or all the mail they write, well, I'm not going to open my mouth. Some of the folks here in town are taken up for me, and some turned against me. I know which is which. There are always people who will quit buying stamps just to get on the right side of Papa Daddy. But here I am, and here I'll stay. I want the world to know I'm happy. And if Stella Rondo should come to me this minute on bended knees and attempt to explain the incidents of her life with Mr. Whitaker, I'd simply put my fingers in both my ears and refuse to listen.
We've just heard Why I Live at the P.O. by Eudora Welty, featuring Ann Scaria, Janice Duclos, Mauro Hantman, and Rachel Warren here on Trinity Rep Radio Theater. Aren't families wonderful?
It is that we have been waiting to do that story, and it's just such a joy because that house is a crazy house, and it's really fun. Annie, you make sister. She is so fascinating because she's 6 kinds of crazy, right? And yet she's right. Because the rest of her family's just as crazy. I love her.
It's all relative.
Right. It is. It's true. I love that one of the first things that Welty tells us is that Stella Rondo told Mr. Whitaker that she was one-sided.
Oh, I know.
Which, it's an amazing detail. But then
the second thing she says is that she stole her birthday. Yeah. She was born exactly to the day. 1 year later, it's like she can't even have her own birthday.
She can't even have her own birthday. And but these little details about, like the use of the word one-sided, it is the whole story. And it's one of the first things that we hear. We really see it through the lens of sister, even the other people who appear. But then you get such a sense of what this house must be like on a hot 4th of July with all the windows closed, right? I mean, it's just a crazy house.
I kept getting this feeling that you really can't make this stuff up. That some of this, obviously really happened, and she just put it all together.
I think the 4th of July in the South must be like Christmas up here to us Cheever folks.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, right. Where the whole family's packed in and nobody can go anywhere.
Right.
Here it's the snow, there it's the heat.
The heat, yeah, the horrors of the heat.
I love the way in both these stories that these people sort of negotiate the world in large part through all the objects around them.
Yes.
And that every object seems to be imbued with some sort of emotional resonance for the people who deal with them. You know what I mean?
It's just
like the
that,
cheap crest tweezers
that's exactly. I wrote that down.
and the
I'm like, that is
flesh-colored
so
kimono
great.
and everything. Like it's like they are responding to the objects the way that you would imagine they'd respond to people.
Yes, it's real. That's the thing, Mara, that I noticed is that everything seems to be alive. Even the 4 o'clocks, the fern, everything has a kind of life energy, a life force. And Bob, you know, one of the fascinating things about Welty, she was born in 1909, died in 2001. So she's really a 20th century writer in her life. And it's all about Jackson, Mississippi, where she grew up. But her parents were from Ohio and West Virginia, and they were teachers. So she sort of remained an outsider her whole life. And she clearly knows these people from the inside, but then also is able to see them from a step away.
Yeah, it's amazing. I can picture the whole thing on film. I just have such clear pictures in my mind of what these people look like. Not that I think that things written this brilliantly should necessarily be filmed, but it's that amazing thing that some pieces of literature can do.
Right.
You can just picture them all.
Yeah.
What I love is the fact that she recognizes that every person has their own fiction.
Yeah.
And that you kind of have to respect that.
Yes.
And in The Petrified Man, Mrs. Fletcher is seeing Leota changing her mind about Mrs. Pike, but she never comes in directly and says, "I told you so." She just lets it kind of evolve, and that's the way that goes, and it's like it turned out okay in the end. And in this one, the narrator, the way Sister, if she had just left Stella Rondo alone and let that fiction lie about it being homesick and the fact that it was an adopted child, but no, she's like a dog with a bone.
Yeah.
She's got that. She needs to crack that.
Well,
one.
she keeps repeating, somebody had to do it, right? I mean, isn't that's like her...
Well, the thing is, Stella Rondo, as far as the narrator is concerned, got to go and be married and have a child.
Yeah.
And she didn't have that opportunity.
Right.
And now she's denying it.
Yeah.
And I think it's interesting to see Mrs. Fletcher and Stella Rondo in both stories kind of trying to deny their motherhood. Mrs. Fletcher thinking about whether to have it, it's not too late, or you know what I mean? So that, because that was a big deal then.
Yeah, and you would think that in this time, in this society, that it would be important to embrace that, or that the characters in the fiction would reflect an embrace. But instead, these women kind of
motherhood became the end of something.
Absolutely.
Right.
Once you rounded that corner as a woman, you never could go back.
Oh,
virginity, you could kind of fudge on a little bit, but once you had a child, forget it. You were gone. And to be a single mother, that was really a stigma.
Oh, that's interesting. So that's why Stella Rondo doesn't want to own the baby.
Yeah.
Okay.
No more chance. No second chance then.
Wow.
Well, she doesn't. I think it's because the baby was conceived before they were
they were
married.
married.
That's
Right,
the stigma,
right.
is that the baby is
Right.
illegitimate.
Yeah. Oh, that's
Although she's 2 years old, 3 years old.
She's two. She's two, but she clearly had to have been pregnant when
they
she
left
left.
like a year and a half ago.
Yeah.
Whatever.
So that's all great. Thank you all
I blame
so
Mr.
much.
Whitaker.
Yeah, clearly. He drank chemicals.
Never
And
trust
his
a man with
Popeyes.
Yes,
Thank you all so much. It was a really great read.
Trinity Rep Radio Theater is a production of WRNI and Trinity Repertory Company. Janice Duclos, director, Emily Atkinson and Janice Duclos, producers, Kurt Columbus, executive producer, Joe O'Connor, general manager, and Jim Moses, sound engineer. This program featured Janice Duclos, Mauro Hantman, Ann Scaria, and Rachel Warren, with Petrified Man and Why I Live at the P.O. by Eudora Welty, published in A Curtain of Green and Other Stories, copyright 1941 and renewed 1969 by Eudora Welty, broadcast by permission of Houghton Mifflin Harcourt Publishing Company and Russell and Volkening Incorporated. Trinity Rep Radio Theater is broadcast the first weekend of every month on WRNI, and you can hear this program again and find archived programs at WRNI.org. Thank you for joining us. I'm Bob C.